The Secret Paths of the Himalayas. Alexandra David-Néel's journey into forbidden lands. The extraordinary adventure of a spiritual pioneer. Part 1. Early Stirrings, 1868-1890. On an autumn evening in October of 1868, the town of Saint-Mandé, on the eastern edge of Paris, glowed under the late-day sun. A newborn girl, Louise Eugénie Alexandrine Marie David, let out her first cry. Her father, Louis David, a schoolteacher, journalist, and political activist, looked upon his daughter with pride, though a faint worry flickered in his eyes. He had brought another mind into a world of uncertainty, a France still reeling from the revolutions of 1848, and one that would soon face the Franco-Prussian War. Her mother, Alexandrine Borgmans, came from a bourgeois Belgian family, more conservative in outlook. Their daughter would grow up between these two polar influences, her father's radical ideas and her mother's social propriety. From an early age, young Alexandra, as she preferred to be called, exhibited a restless curiosity. She devoured books on philosophy, religion, and history. By the time she was a teenager, she had pored over the works of prominent Western thinkers, but it was the East that captured her imagination most powerfully. She found herself rereading volumes of Oriental texts again and again, particularly anything related to Buddhism and Hinduism. Alexandra found in these doctrines a transcendent cosmic order, unlike the social constraints and polite pieties she observed in her immediate environs. During a walk with her father in the Bois de Vincennes, she turned to him, her pale eyes bright with excitement. "Why do we see so little about other worlds, Father? Why do we not teach in school about India, about the Tibetan plateaus that rest like clouds above Asia?" Her father chuckled. "My dear, it's not that these places aren't known, but our schools do not always delve into what's beyond our borders. Men of my generation are occupied with the affairs of Europe, politics, revolutions, war. Perhaps you will be the one who changes that." Though it was said lightly, Alexandra took these words to heart. She grew more determined to learn languages, read texts, and study the East for herself. Before long, she was scribbling notes from dusty old translations of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and early Buddhist sutras. She had little idea that these interests would one day carry her across forbidding mountains and secret monastic enclaves and transform her into a pioneering explorer and scholar. Part 2. The Young Cosmopolitan, 1890-1904. Opera and Early Independence. In her late teens and early 20s, Alexandra's intellect and passions took on new forms. She showed remarkable musical talent, leading her to study singing. Through perseverance, she gained the opportunity to perform in several opera houses throughout Europe. She took on stage names, including Alexandra Miriel, and found that her love for performance paralleled her love for travel. Engaging in opera tours allowed her to experience different cities, London, Naples, Athens, Hanoi, when traveling to French Indochina, and beyond. She relished the freedom. No longer confined to the rigid expectations of her mother's world, she found the stage both liberating and surprisingly introspective. Even as she performed in front of large audiences, she felt she was exploring her inner voice. In between rehearsals and performances, she stole away to libraries and museums, immersing herself in Asian art, reading anything she could about spiritual traditions of the Far East. Marriage to Philippe Neel. In 1904, at age 36, she met Philippe Neel, an engineer for the French railways in Tunisia. The two married in Tunis, though Alexandra remained uncompromising in her need for freedom. Philippe, older and somewhat more staid, admired her intellect and curiosity. He wasn't blind to her wanderlust or her refusal to conform to conventional marital roles. He accepted that she might be absent for stretches of time. In fact, he even financially supported her travels. Their relationship was unconventional by the standards of the day, but it was a meeting of respect. Philippe recognized his wife's genius and thirst for adventure. During one evening in Tunis, Alexandra paced across a tiled veranda with French doors open to the warm, perfumed air of the North African coast. "I want to go," she told Philippe, her voice resonant with determination. "Go where?" "Everywhere. India, Tibet. I have read about the lamas who keep centuries of knowledge hidden in their gompas. My heart is calling me to visit them," she insisted. Philippe's brow furrowed. He was a practical man, but he had come to know his wife's unwavering resolve. "If that is what you truly desire, we will arrange it," he replied after a pause. "But promise, you'll write to me." "I will," Alexandra said softly, placing a hand over his. "I will write every day if I can." Thus, with her husband's understanding and some financial backing, Alexandra began her first step toward Asia. It was not yet the truly transformative journey she would one day recount in her books, but it lit the lamp of possibility. Part the Third, Glimpses of the East, 1904–1911. First forays to India and Ceylon. Alexandra's early forays took her to Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, India, and parts of Southeast Asia. She was overwhelmed by the color, the vibrancy, the scents of jasmine and incense, the layering of cultures. She learned basic Sanskrit, Pali, and began dabbling in Tibetan scripts in her quest to read Buddhist texts in their original form. It was in Ceylon that she encountered her first serious Buddhist teacher, an elderly Sinhalese monk known as Venerable Sumangala. He was impressed by the Frenchwoman's earnestness and scholarly knowledge of Buddhist philosophy. One humid afternoon in the courtyard of the temple in Colombo, he beckoned Alexandra to sit with him under the shade of a large banyan tree. "Madame," he said in halting French, "the path is not only in books. We can read 1,000 sutras and recite all the doctrines, but if we do not quiet the mind and cultivate compassion, it is all chatter." Alexandra's eyes shone with curiosity. "How does one quiet the mind, venerable teacher, when my mind is so full of ideas?" He offered a kind smile. "One steps back from the stream. Observe without clinging. Meditation is more than posture. It is the practice of seeing the nature of all things as fleeting." Over the next months, she endeavored in various meditative exercises. Her curiosity grew into genuine spiritual pursuit. She was no longer an armchair theorist. She began to integrate practice with theory, forging a path that would eventually become the centerpiece of her life. Theosophical encounters. Around this time, Alexandra also brushed shoulders with theosophical circles in India. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, was a Western esoteric organization deeply fascinated by Eastern religions. They championed universal brotherhood, comparative religion, and the study of occult phenomena. At one gathering in Adyar near Madras, Alexandra engaged in spirited discussions with a group of theosophists about the meaning of Mahatmas, advanced spiritual adepts said to reside in remote areas of Tibet or the Himalayas. While some Western seekers romanticized these hidden teachers, Alexandra's perspective was more methodical. "I do not doubt their existence," she said during a salon-style discussion under a broad veranda. "But I believe one must search them out directly, not only through letters precipitated from beyond." She referred, with a polite smile, to the theosophical law of occult correspondence. "I want to see for myself the realities of these Tibetan masters, not just read about them." Her statement earned both admiration and skepticism from the group. Yet for Alexandra, It was the clarion call of authenticity that demanded she push further inland, further north, higher into the spiritual heart of Asia. Part 4. Into the Himalayas and the court of the 13th Dalai Lama, 1912–1916. Arrival in Sikkim. By 1912, Alexandra was in her early 40s. She journeyed to Darjeeling in the eastern Himalayas, crossing from the sweltering Indian plains into the crisp mountain air. Nestled between Nepal and Bhutan lay the kingdom of Sikkim, an independent Himalayan realm with deep Tibetan Buddhist traditions. It was here that Alexandra's exploration took a profound turn. She traveled on foot and sometimes by pony across rugged trails that zigzagged through terraced fields and across high passes. Local porters carried her belongings. She established a base near the capital, Gangtok, where she made acquaintances with British political officers who were both intrigued by and wary of her. After all, Tibet was officially closed to foreigners. The British, who held political sway in the region, kept a close eye on inquisitive foreigners who might upset the delicate geopolitical balance. Meeting the 13th Dalai Lama, a stroke of remarkable fortune befell Alexandra. In 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama, Thubten Gyatso, was in temporary exile in India following Chinese incursions into Tibet. Through the good offices of local aristocrats and British intermediaries, Alexandra gained an audience. She entered a reception hall set up in a large villa in Darjeeling. The Dalai Lama, wrapped in maroon robes, sat on a dais flanked by monks with solemn, watchful expressions. She prostrated respectfully, adopting the Tibetan gesture, and approached. The Dalai Lama regarded her with a measured gaze that seemed to see straight into her fervent curiosity. "You have come far," he said softly through a translator, "seeking the teachings of our land. Tibet is vast and not always hospitable, but the Dharma can flourish in any heart that is truly open." She bowed once more. "Your Holiness, I wish to understand, to learn, and if possible, to bring some of this understanding to those in the West." He nodded. "Then study well. Listen to our lamas and yogis. Understand the methods, but do not forget the essence of compassion." This brief exchange kindled in Alexandra a sense of mission. The Dalai Lama's words were measured and formal, yet they resonated like a bell across her consciousness. She would delve ever deeper, she promised herself. She began forging friendships with local monastics and advanced practitioners in remote areas, hungry to learn their secrets of mind training, meditation, and esoteric rituals. The Hermit of Lhasa. Among the many profound relationships Alexandra developed in Sikkim, none was more pivotal than that with the Gomchen hermit of Lhasa. High in the northern reaches of Sikkim, nestled in a valley overshadowed by towering snow peaks, she found this ascetic yogi dwelling in a small hut. He became her teacher, and she spent months studying meditation techniques that included breath control, pranayama, and the famed tummo, inner heat, practices. On a cold evening inside the hermit's hut, the wind howling outside, she asked the Gomchen, "Revered Lama, my mind feels restless, as if hundreds of monkeys jump from tree to tree in my thoughts. How can I settle it into clarity?" The hermit, wrapped in a ragged woolen shawl, chuckled. "All beings suffer from the monkey mind. Do not fight it, but watch it, like a mother watches a child. Then gradually, the child calms. You will see emptiness and clarity are two sides of the same lamp." Under his guidance, Alexandra practiced for hours on end, learning to regulate her body temperature in the frigid Himalayan climate. She engaged in chanting, visualization of deities, and the forging of an unbreakable concentration on the nature of mind. In later writings, she credited these hermetic teachings with helping her survive hardship and extreme climates during her travels. Part 5. Trials, Tribulations, and a Spiritual Son, 1916–1919. Political tensions. The British administration in India grew concerned about Alexandra's close ties with high-ranking Tibetan monks and aristocrats. Rumors circulated that she might be engaging in clandestine political affairs or stirring up trouble in the sensitive Himalayan border regions. In reality, Alexandra's intrigue was entirely spiritual and cultural. Yet, the colonial officers, unused to a Frenchwoman of such intrepid nature, placed restrictions on her movements. In 1916, after repeated warnings, she was politely expelled from Sikkim. She crossed the border into Bhutan for a brief stay, but the Bhutanese authorities, under British pressure, asked her to leave as well. Frustrated but undeterred, Alexandra returned to the Indian plains. The journey down from the high passes was both physically and emotionally taxing. She lamented having to leave her beloved teachers and mountainous sanctuary. Adoption of Yongden. During her time in Sikkim, Alexandra had become very close to a young Sikkimese Lama, Afur Yongden, whose intelligence and earnest devotion impressed her. Though not a child in the Western sense, he was in his teens when they first met, she eventually adopted him as her spiritual son and companion on her travels. The adoption became official in 1929, but from 1916 onward they were nearly inseparable, forging a profound bond that would last the rest of their lives. As they boarded a train in the bustling station in Kalimpong, Alexandra turned to Yongden. "We cannot stay here, but I promise you, we will not abandon our studies. The path is not confined to a single place." Yongden, thoughtful beyond his years, nodded. "Wherever we go, we carry the teachings, don't we?" His words touched Alexandra deeply. In that moment, she recognized that her quest for spiritual knowledge was not restricted by official boundaries. It was carried within her heart and in the companionship of those she held dear. Journeys across India. For the next few years, she and Yongden traveled across India's holy sites. From the Buddhist pilgrimage areas of Bodh Gaya and Sarnath to Hindu centers like Varanasi and Rishikesh, she sought to understand the diverse tapestry of India's spiritual traditions. She conversed with swamis, nath yogis, and Christian missionaries. She read Tibetan texts in libraries in Calcutta and Madras, constantly refining her knowledge. Her letters back to Philippe in Tunis described her reverence at the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, under whose ancestor tree the Buddha was said to have attained enlightenment. She also wrote of the chaotic energy of the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad, where millions of pilgrims gathered at the confluence of rivers. In one letter, she penned, "Dearest Philippe, I see in this land the spectacle of humanity's longing for God, or nirvana, or some sense of liberation. And in the midst of the swirling crowds, I feel closer to an inner silence than ever before. India is a universe unto itself, raw, sublime, maddening, and enlightening all at once." Part 6. The Forbidden City, 1919–1924. Preparation for Tibet. Despite her forced departure from the Himalayan kingdoms a few years earlier, Alexandra's desire to reach the heart of Tibet only grew stronger. In 1919, she and Yongden headed northward again, traveling through China and eventually making their way toward eastern Tibet. War, political upheaval, and dangerous terrain did little to discourage her. In fact, she seemed energized by each new obstacle. For several months, they stayed in Kumbum Monastery in present-day Qinghai Province, studying under learned lamas and refining their Tibetan language skills. Alexandra immersed herself in manuscripts that detailed Vajrayana Buddhist practices, protective rituals, and spells. She absorbed the nuances of ceremonial rites, determined to see firsthand if the phenomena described in texts, like telepathy or psychic powers, had any basis in reality. Entering Lhasa in disguise. Tibet of the early 1920s was a closed land. Foreigners were rarely allowed inside, and the penalty for entering without permission was severe. Still, Alexandra hatched a plan to reach Lhasa, the holy city, in disguise. She cut her hair, smeared her face with soot, dressed in ragged Tibetan robes, and pretended to be a pilgrim accompanied by her son, Yongden, who passed more easily for a local. With only a few possessions carried by yak or donkey, they trekked across the high-altitude passes. In the biting cold, Alexandra and Yongden sometimes relied on the tummo practices she had learned to keep warm. Nights were spent in caves or flimsy tents, the sky awash with brilliant stars. Amala, Yongden whispered one particularly cold night, using the Tibetan term for mother. Do you remember the Gomchen's instructions for generating inner heat? Yes, she replied through chattering teeth. Closing her eyes, she visualized a blazing flame at the level of her navel, radiating warmth throughout her body. She breathed deeply, focusing her mind on the sensation. Gradually, her limbs stopped shaking, and a subtle warmth replaced the bone-chilling cold. Slowly, they inched closer to Lhasa, blending into the streams of pilgrims moving toward the sacred city. There was constant fear of detection by Tibetan officials or suspicious locals. Alexandra spoke little, adopting the mannerisms of a devout pilgrim. Finally, in February 1924, they arrived at the outskirts of Lhasa. The golden roofs of the Potala Palace glistened in the sunlight. Tears filled Alexandra's eyes. This was the city she had dreamt of for decades, the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. For 2 months, she and Yongden stayed in Lhasa, visiting the Jokhang temple, prostrating around the Barkhor circuit, secretly observing religious ceremonies that few foreigners had ever witnessed. Although historians debate whether she was the first Western woman to enter Lhasa, some mention others who may have preceded her, there is no doubt that her feat was astounding. She took notes furtively, storing them in hidden pockets. She observed the daily life of monks, the fervor of pilgrims, and the imposing seat of Tibet's government. This time in Lhasa would later inspire one of her most famous works, My Journey to Lhasa, published in 1927. Part 7. Return to Europe and Literary Achievements, 1925–1937. Fame and Scholarship. By 1925, Alexandra decided to return to Europe with Yongden. Word of her extraordinary achievement preceded her. She was hailed in France and elsewhere in Europe as an intrepid explorer. Her scholarly abilities, coupled with her personal experiences, made her uniquely authoritative in the field of Tibetan studies. She gave lectures, wrote articles, and stunned audiences with stories about living hermits, advanced meditative practices, and the wonders of Lhasa. Philippe welcomed her in France with a mixture of relief, pride, and resignation. He understood by now that his wife's adventures were far from over. But for a while, she settled into the role of writer and scholar, working feverishly on manuscripts. During this period, she published several seminal works: My Journey to Lhasa, 1927, a riveting first-person account of her secret trek into the Forbidden City, describing in vivid detail the hardships, the breathtaking landscapes, and her interactions with Tibetan society. Initiations and Initiates in Tibet, 1931, an exploration of tantric rituals and the process of spiritual initiation in Tibetan monasteries, offering insights into esoteric traditions that were little understood in the West. Magic and Mystery in Tibet, originally in French as Mystique et Magicien du Tibet, 1929. Perhaps her most famous work, detailing the psychic and mystical practices she observed, including levitation, telepathy, and tumo. In the salons of Paris, academic circles in London and beyond, Alexandra's name became synonymous with the hidden wisdom of Tibet. She never sensationalized these topics without providing contextual grounding in Buddhist philosophy. She stressed that many phenomena labeled magic by Westerners were, in her understanding, the result of disciplined mental training. Encounters with other scholars? Alexandra corresponded widely with scholars of religion, anthropology, and Oriental studies. She visited the Sorbonne and gave talks at institutions throughout Europe. She was invited to meet members of the British Royal Geographical Society who hung on her every word about Tibetan topography. At a crowded lecture in London, she concluded her talk with a pointed remark. We in the West must be cautious not to idealize Tibet as a mystical wonderland, nor dismiss it as mere superstition. The practices I witnessed are rooted in centuries of disciplined study and spiritual insight. If we are humble enough, we might learn from them ways to master our own minds. Her words struck a chord with the audience, many of whom stood to applaud her courage and clarity of thought. Part the 8th. Later Journeys, War, and Return to Dean, 1938-1946. Travels in China in the war years. Despite her age, she was now nearing 70, Alexandra felt another pull eastward. In 1937, she traveled again to China via the Trans-Siberian Railway, with Yongden still at her side. They visited Buddhist temples, Taoist hermitages, and the remnants of a China on the brink of war with Japan. This journey proved fraught with dangers as the Second Sino-Japanese War escalated in 1937. Bombings, looting, and political chaos were widespread. Alexandra navigated the turmoil with a calm that astonished onlookers. She often invoked her Buddhist training, focusing on equanimity even when forced to shelter from aerial raids. Moving from city to city, she recorded observations about Chinese Buddhism and local religious practices. Yet the hostilities made thorough exploration almost impossible. Eventually, she and Yongden fled the war zone and returned to Europe around 1946 after the end of World War II. Settling in Digne-les-Bains. Exhausted from the chaos of global conflict, Alexandra settled in Digne-les-Bains in southeastern France. She purchased a villa she named Samten Dzong, Fortress of Meditation. Though the region's lavender fields and alpine vistas were far from the Himalayas, it was a place of retreat where she could continue her writing and reflection. Even into her late 70s and 80s, she maintained a rigorous schedule, working on translations of Tibetan texts, writing letters, and receiving curious visitors from around the world. She and Yongden lived a quiet, studious life. Yet for Alexandra, there was always a sense that her real home was somewhere in the high plateaus of Tibet. She told visitors of her hope that one day Tibet would open more freely and that Westerners might appreciate the spiritual treasures it held. Part 9. Legacy and Final Reflections, 1947-1969. Further publications and recognitions. Over the 2 decades following the Second World War, Alexandra continued to publish. Among her notable works were Immortality and Reincarnation, Psychical Research, and Metapsychics in the Borderlands of Human Knowledge, Buddhism, Its Doctrines and Its Methods, Tibetan Journey, various editions and expansions of her original travelogues, Her writings combined anthropological observation with a personal, almost intimate spiritual quest. She also mentored younger scholars, encouraging them to conduct fieldwork with open minds and hearts. Passage of time. As she aged into her 90s, she refused to slow down too much. When visitors to Samten asked about her memories, she gladly recounted stories of her infiltration into Lhasa, the gem-like brilliance of the Himalayan peaks, and the nights spent chanting with hermit monks under star-laden skies. When asked, "Madame David-Néel, how did you find the courage to attempt all of this?" She would smile with a mischievous glint in her eye. Courage? I don't know if it was courage or an inner necessity. Something greater than myself pulled me onward. To me, fear was just another emotion, like the cold, something you learn to manage by focusing on a deeper warmth. The Tibetan diaspora, following China's assertion of power in Tibet in the 1950s, deeply saddened her. She sympathized with the plight of Tibetan refugees, though she continued to emphasize that the essence of Tibetan Buddhism could survive anywhere, as it was not bound by borders. Last conversations with Yongden. Yongden, always by her side, grew into a mature scholar in his own right. During the quieter moments in Dean, they would discuss new translations of Tibetan scriptures, comparing various commentaries. They also debated philosophical points. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the garden, Alexandra sipped tea, while Yongden read aloud a passage from the Prajnaparamita. All phenomena are like a dream, an illusion, a bubble, a shadow, he read. Thus should one meditate. Alexandra closed her eyes. My dear Yongden, she murmured, I have walked across illusions, from the streets of Paris to the peaks of the Himalayas. Perhaps now I understand a little more. But the dream continues until the end of this life. They shared a peaceful smile. The teacher-student dynamic had long since evolved into a familial love infused with spiritual partnership. Death and beyond. Alexandra David-Néel lived to be over 100 years old. She passed away on September 8, 1969, leaving behind a monumental legacy. Her ashes, and later those of Yongden, who died a few years before her, were eventually scattered in the Ganges River, fulfilling her wish for a final union with the East. In retrospect, her life story stands as an extraordinary tapestry of scholarly brilliance, fearless exploration, and spiritual depth. She was simultaneously an opera singer, an intrepid explorer, a yogi of sorts, and a prolific writer. She exemplified what it meant to build bridges across cultures, particularly between Asia and the West, well before the era of mass tourism or widespread global media. Epilogue. The Enduring Flame. Even today, scholars and travelers read Alexandra's works, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, My Journey to Lhasa, and others, with a sense of awe. Her first-hand descriptions of esoteric Tibetan practices, her sympathetic portrayal of local customs, and her willingness to become a part of the cultures she studied were far ahead of her time. She was not content to be a mere tourist or a distant observer. She sought initiation, living as a hermit, enduring the same hardships as local practitioners. Modern historians note that while some of her accounts might be shaped by her personal lens, she was, after all, writing for a Western audience in the early 20th century. Her meticulous efforts to remain authentic and respectful are unmistakable. She neither glorified nor denigrated. Instead, she tried to understand and experience. When asked about her journey in a hypothetical interview toward the end of her life, one might imagine her smiling faintly. My child, she would say, the greatest journey is not the one across the mountains, but the one that traverses the heights and depths of our own mind. Tibet was a doorway for me to discover that. If my writings can help open that doorway for others, then I have done my part. And with that, the conversation would end, leaving behind a sense of quiet inspiration, just as Alexandra David-Néel herself continues to do through her enduring works and the living spirit of her travels. Additional historical and contextual notes. Colonial context. Alexandra's travels took place during the British Raj in India and at a time when Tibet maintained a precarious independence. British officials were wary of foreigners who might upset political balances. Her multiple expulsions from Sikkim reflect the tensions of that era. European reception. Upon her return, Alexandra found the intellectual climate in Europe intrigued by spiritualism, theosophy, and Eastern mysticism. She gained fame both for her adventurous spirit and for the scholarly depth of her work. Spiritual initiations. Much of what she learned, for example Tummo practice, certain tantric visualizations, was carefully guarded in Tibetan traditions. She represented one of the first Westerners to gain genuine instruction in these esoteric arts. Her accounts, though groundbreaking, also sparked debate about the extent of publicizing such private teachings. Relationship with Yongden. Though she officially adopted Afa Yongden in 1929, their bond formed long before. While some have speculated on the nature of their relationship, the weight of evidence suggests a deep, spiritual and familial connection based on mutual respect. They traveled as mother and son, companions on the Buddhist path. Impact on Western Buddhism. Alexandra David-Néel's writings brought Tibetan Buddhism into Western public consciousness decades before the arrival of Tibetan lamas who fled following the Chinese annexation of Tibet, post-1950. She can be viewed as a precursor to the wave of interest in Tibetan teachings that emerged strongly in the second half of the 20th century. Legacy in Dean, Samtenjong, her home in Digne-les-Bains, now serves as a museum and a testament to her life. Visitors can see her study, her correspondences, and artifacts she brought back from Asia. In all these ways, Alexandra David-Néel's life story serves as an extraordinary example of cross-cultural exploration, intellectual fervor, and spiritual dedication. Even after her death, the echoes of her journey continue to inspire, reminding us that frontiers, be they physical, cultural, or spiritual, exist to be encountered with courage, curiosity, and compassion.